General Hospital spoilers for Monday, July 7th tease that Gio stood quietly in the dimly lit basement archive of General Hospital, his breath held like a fragile thread suspended in time. All around him were boxes of patient files and outdated computer terminals, dusty from years of disuse, silent witnesses to lives rewritten, births rearranged, and truths buried. He hadn't come here with a plan, only a question. But as he pulled a forgotten folder from a rusted drawer and saw the faded name that would change everything, he realized he was no longer just asking questions. He was chasing ghosts. For most of his life, Gio had accepted the story he'd been told. That he and Rocco were half-brothers. That Dante had done his best. That Lulu had raised Rocco in love and sacrifice, and that what happened with Britt was complicated, but over. He believed, or maybe chose to believe, that even with all the tragedy they'd endured, the foundation of their family still stood on truth. But lately, something had changed. Rocco was distant, distracted. Consumed by something he refused to name. The arrival of cryptic files at the Quartermain estate. The tension between Dante and Lulu. And above all, the whispers of Britt's return, rumors too wild to be real, too persistent to be ignored. Gio began asking questions. Not the kind that people could lie about easily, but the kind buried in documents. Electronic records, and clinic logs long forgotten. What he found shocked him. The name, Britt, appeared in connection with a flagged embryo transfer file, dated months before Rocco's birth. With donor codes that matched Dante and Lulu. But the recipient? The woman who carried the child? It wasn't Lulu. It was Britt. What had once been dismissed as ancient scandal was suddenly exposed as the root of everything. Rocco had not simply been stolen, he had been incubated in a lie. Gio sat down. His hands shaking as he flipped through each line of evidence. A nurse's unsigned incident report. A digital audit showing deleted genetic logs. And then, the final confirmation. An internal memo referencing Project Omega, a secret program allegedly approved by a WSB liaison, dealing with unauthorized embryo implantation, one of the recipients being Britt. Joe's world tilted. Rocco had not only been created through deception, he had been the center of a dark, controlled manipulation. And if Rocco had no idea, if he still believed that Lulu had carried him, then the truth was a ticking bomb beneath their already fragile bond. For Gio, the revelation didn't just change how he viewed Rocco, it changed how he viewed himself. If people like Britt, Liesel, and even Dante had played God with Rocco's life, what else had been altered? Could his own story have been tampered with too? Was he really who they said he was? Or was he also part of some deeper plan, another pawn in the legacy of deception that now haunted the Falconary name? He had to tell Rocco. But how? The idea of shattering Rocco's entire sense of self made Gio sick to his stomach. And yet, what scared him even more was the thought that someone else, Jason, Sonny, or worse, Sidwell, might weaponize that truth before Rocco ever had the chance to own it. Gio knew firsthand how dangerous the truth could be in the wrong hands. He had seen what lies had done to Christina, to Natalia, to Drew. He wouldn't let that happen to his brother. Still, Gio hesitated. Every time he saw Rocco now, every sarcastic joke, every look of quiet despair, he felt the weight of the secret pressing down harder. He was walking through the motions of normal life, but underneath, he was drowning in knowledge he hadn't asked for. And he wasn't sure if the truth would save Rocco, or destroy him. At night, Gio found himself writing everything down in a private notebook he kept hidden in the lining of his backpack. Not just the facts, but the feelings. The betrayal. The confusion. The anger. He wrote letters to Rocco he never sent. Drafted conversations he never had the courage to start. And in those pages, Gio wasn't just a brother, he was a witness, a keeper of truth, and a boy trying to navigate a minefield with no clear path forward. The return of Britt only made things worse. If the rumors were true, if Britt was alive, possibly involved in underground genetic research, and potentially working with or against the WSB, then Gio had to act quickly. He couldn't let her twist the narrative, couldn't allow her to re-enter Rocco's life with more lies, more justifications. The time for silence had passed. Gio had to become more than a brother. He had to become the guardian of Rocco's truth, whether Rocco was ready to hear it or not. And yet, something inside Gio broke each time he imagined the fallout. Lulu, already barely holding herself together, would crumble under the weight of Rocco's rejection. Dante, desperate to rebuild what was lost, would face the full force of Rocco's fury. And Rocco himself, already so fragile, so full of questions, might not survive the collapse of everything he believed. But Gio couldn't go back. He had seen too much. And so, he prepared. Not for war, but for reckoning. He began documenting the evidence, scanning and encrypting every file. He sought out Jason, not for permission, but for backup. He told him everything. And to Joe's relief, Jason didn't flinch. He simply nodded and said, "He deserves the truth. We both know what it feels like when someone takes that from you." Now, with the storm approaching, Britt's shadow looming, the wedding of Willow and Drew unraveling, and Sunny growing ever more paranoid, Gio knows he's standing on the edge of something irreversible. But this time, he isn't afraid. Because if the truth about Rocco's identity is going to explode, Gio will be the one holding the match, not to destroy, but to illuminate. Because no one, especially Rocco, deserves to live in the dark any longer. Cody and Brooke Lynn could no longer endure the false calm that had settled over their world like a fragile sheet of glass, quietly threatening to shatter under the weight of everything unsaid. The lies had lingered for too long, embedded in the subtle pauses of Lulu's retellings, in the strained smiles, in the deliberate silences whenever Rocco asked about his birth or the early years that never quite added up. At first, they ignored it, told themselves that some truths were too painful to revisit. That maybe Lulu was protecting her son the only way she knew how. But now, everything was unraveling. Rocco had changed. He walked through life like someone who had seen behind a curtain no one had meant for him to touch. His eyes no longer held ease, only questions. His tone was sharper, his presence heavier. There was a distance growing between him and everyone who loved him, and the cause was no longer a mystery, it was the weight of a truth being hidden from him by the one person he had trusted most. Brooke Lynn, once fiercely loyal to Lulu, began to see the cracks in her friend's carefully controlled version of events. She had wanted to believe that Lulu was simply afraid. That she didn't know how to explain the painful, complicated truth to her son. But with each passing day, it became harder to justify the lie. Lulu had known. She had carried the truth in her eyes. In her posture, in the way she stiffened every time Britt's name surfaced. She had chosen silence, and in doing so, had let the lie grow into something unmanageable, something toxic. Cody, too, had once tried to stay out of it. He understood secrets. His own life had been shaped by the stories other people told to cover up what they didn't want him to discover. But watching Rocco suffer in silence, unraveling from the inside out, made him realize how much damage had already been done. They began putting together the pieces not through confrontation, but through patterns. The stories that didn't align. The quiet deflections in conversations. The faint traces of guilt that Lulu never quite hid well enough. Cody, ever observant, remembered an offhand comment Lulu made years ago about wishing she could take back choices from the past, choices involving Britt, involving Dante, involving the pregnancy that never felt like it belonged to her. Brooke Lynn uncovered a letter, unfinished, folded between the pages of an old journal Lulu had once left behind in a hospital room. The letter was meant for Rocco. Its tone was hesitant, emotional, and broken. It spoke of truths withheld, of regret, of a woman trapped between the instinct to protect and the fear of being rejected. But it was never delivered. It was hidden, forgotten, buried like the rest of the truth. In their own way, both Cody and Brooke Lynn had reached the same conclusion. They could no longer remain passive. They could no longer shield Lulu from the consequences of her choices when those very choices were tearing Rocco apart. The lie was no longer just a family secret, it had become a weapon, slowly chipping away at the emotional stability of a boy who deserved better. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They weren't trying to destroy Lulu. But the time for protecting her at Rocco's expense had come to an end. What haunted Brooke Lynn most was the realization that this wasn't just about Rocco. It was about every ripple the lie had caused, about Joe's confusion and sense of displacement, about Dante's haunted expression every time he looked at his son. About the legacy of manipulation and silence that seemed to pass from one generation to the next in Port Charles. Cody, who had spent his life fighting to be seen through the fog of his own complicated parentage, saw in Rocco a mirror. And he refused to let that reflection become another cautionary tale. So they chose truth. Not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Brooke Lynn gathered the evidence, records, fragments of Lulu's writings, and testimonies quietly collected over months. Cody reached out to Jason, who confirmed what they feared. The truth about Rocco's birth had been manipulated by more than one person, and Lulu had known more than she ever admitted. The day they made their decision, the sky over Port Charles was gray, heavy with the weight of a storm not yet fallen. It felt fitting. Neither of them expected forgiveness. They didn't need it. What they needed was for Rocco to finally understand who he was, and who had chosen to keep that from him. If that truth burned bridges, then so be it. If it fractured what remained of Lulu's reputation, it was a consequence of her own silence. What mattered now was clarity. What mattered now was giving Rocco the chance to rebuild his life on something real. Because lies, no matter how gently told, eventually become cages. And Cody and Brooke Lynn were done pretending they didn't see the bars. Lulu was seething, quietly, dangerously, and with a heat that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. The walls around her were closing in, and every direction she turned, she found herself under siege. Once admired for her resilience and strength, Lulu now felt her world unraveling at a pace she could no longer control. Everything was shifting, alliances, perceptions, truths, and one by one. The events surrounding her were stacking up like calculated attacks, stripping her of the narrative she had spent years trying to protect. At first, it was the questions, small, seemingly harmless inquiries from Rocco, from Brooke Lynn, from Dante. Questions she'd deflected with ease in the past. But now, they returned with sharper edges. Laced with suspicion and emotion she couldn't silence. Then came the accusations, subtle at first, buried in tone, in sideways glances, in the unease people couldn't quite hide. And when Cody and Brooke Lynn finally revealed what they had uncovered, her long-held silence about Britt's role in Rocco's birth. The hidden letter she never had the courage to give him, it felt less like a confrontation and more like a betrayal. To Lulu, this wasn't just about a lie. It was about being cornered. About having her entire motherhood reduced to omissions and shame. She had survived a coma, endured the loss of years, fought to reclaim her place in her son's life. And now, all of it was slipping away because of one truth she wasn't ready to reveal. But worse than the exposure was the sense that everyone around her had already chosen a side, and it wasn't hers. She could feel it everywhere. In Dante's hesitations. In Rocco's guarded eyes. In the way Jason had gone silent, and even Laura had begun speaking to her in carefully measured words. The people she once believed would stand by her were now stepping back, uncertain of her choices, questioning her integrity. It was as if the entire town had collectively decided she no longer deserved the benefit of the doubt. And in the shadows of this judgment, a new obsession began to grow inside her, one fueled by fear, desperation, and a rising paranoia that someone was orchestrating all of this. It no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like a coordinated assault on her identity, her motherhood, her worth. She began replaying every conversation, analyzing every glance, wondering who knew what, and how long they had known. The thought that Cody and Brooke Lynn had been quietly gathering evidence behind her back felt like a knife to the chest. And yet, what haunted her most was the possibility that Rocco, her son, her heart, was slipping away, not because of the lie itself, but because of how long she had clung to it. Lulu's rage wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was cold, controlled, and calculated. She began pushing back, trying to reclaim the narrative. She confronted Brooke Lynn, accused her of betrayal, of violating the sanctity of family. She cornered Dante with questions of loyalty. She even considered going public, spinning her story, rebranding herself as a misunderstood mother forced into impossible choices. But every attempt to regain control only highlighted how much she had already lost. The community no longer saw her as the warrior returning from the brink. They saw her as the woman who couldn't let go of a lie, even when it cost her son's trust. The psychological toll was devastating. Lulu stopped sleeping. She reread the letter she had written to Rocco over and over, rewriting it in her mind. Convincing herself that she would have told him, eventually. But that justification no longer soothed her. It only deepened the spiral. She started seeing shadows where there were none. Suspecting everyone, questioning everything. Her obsession with regaining control became all-consuming. She no longer acted out of love or protection, she acted out of fear. Fear of being irrelevant. Fear of being erased. Fear of losing the only role she still had in Rocco's life. And in that desperation, a new battle was born. Lulu was no longer trying to protect her secret, she was preparing to go on the offensive. She began compiling her own list of betrayals, her own theories, her own quiet threats. If they wanted to expose her, she would expose them. If they thought she was the villain, she would show them how dangerous she could be when cornered. Because in Lulu's mind, this was no longer about a lie from the past. This was about survival. About identity. About power. And as her world unraveled, piece by piece, she clung to one truth above all. She would not go down quietly. Not without a fight. Not without showing everyone that beneath the wounded mother and betrayed woman was someone who could still strike back. Because in her eyes, this wasn't just a reckoning, it was war. And the obsession now burning inside her wasn't one she would put out easily. Anna confronted Sidwell with a tension in her voice that even she couldn't fully conceal, her words sharp, calculated, but laced with something deeper, fear. The fire at Charlie's pub had already left the town rattled, but for Anna, the destruction wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. It marked the beginning of a new kind of terror. One that didn't come from shadows or strangers, but from men who walked freely in daylight, cloaked in charm, power, and cold calculation. And Sidwell, with his carefully measured speech and unsettling calm, stood at the center of it. She asked him directly if he had any connection to the fire, her gaze unwavering. Searching for even the slightest crack in his composed facade. But Sidwell, as always, deflected with a quiet smirk and vague words that neither confirmed nor denied. It was the way he responded, not with denial, not with outrage, but with amused indifference, that made Anna's stomach twist. He wasn't just hiding something, he was enjoying the game. The fire wasn't an act of rage, it had been a message. And Sidwell, whether he had lit the match or orchestrated it from a distance, knew exactly what that message was meant to provoke. The implications were staggering. The blaze that nearly killed Christina, that devastated Sunny and fractured a fragile sense of peace in Port Charles, wasn't just a random act of violence. It was calculated. It was strategic. And Anna, with her years of experience and scars earned from confronting threats that wore many masks, began to feel the weight of a familiar fear pressing down again. This wasn't just about arson anymore. It was about psychological warfare. About dismantling trust, shifting power, and dragging the city into chaos, one targeted act at a time. Anna knew Sidwell's capabilities. She had read the files, the reports scrubbed clean by WSB insiders. The rumors that had followed him from foreign postings and black site operations. He was dangerous not because he was impulsive, but because he was precise. He didn't act out of emotion. He acted with intent. And that intent, whatever it truly was, had now begun to take shape in Port Charles. The fire was the opening shot. And what terrified Anna most was that it had worked. It had provoked Sonny. It had isolated Christina. It had destabilized the balance of trust between factions in town. And all without leaving a single piece of undeniable evidence behind. Her obsession began to grow. Anna started reviewing surveillance logs, forensic data, and private testimonies from staff and bystanders who had been near the pub that night. Patterns began to emerge, timelines that aligned too perfectly, names that appeared too often, connections between Sidwell and individuals with histories of pyrotechnic sabotage. But none of it was conclusive. And that, in itself, was chilling. The absence of proof wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Anna was dealing with someone who knew how to cover his tracks so well. Even the truth felt like a theory. And still, Sidwell watched her. Every interaction was a chess match, every conversation a test of control. He never flinched. Never raised his voice. He spoke to her the way one might speak to a colleague in a high-stakes negotiation, not with hostility, but with quiet reminders of shared knowledge, mutual understanding. And an undercurrent of menace that made Anna's instincts scream. The closer she got to the truth, the more he seemed to anticipate her moves. It was as if he had already calculated her reactions. And was merely waiting for her to catch up. Anna's dreams began to twist. She saw fire in her sleep. She heard Christina's screams. She imagined what might happen if the next target wasn't a pub, but something more personal. A hospital wing. A school. A Quartermain estate. And she knew, this wasn't just about taking Sonny down. This was about reshaping Port Charles from the inside out. About creating a fear so persistent, so pervasive, that no one would feel safe, especially those who thought they were untouchable. Her fear, though silent, bled into her every move. She stopped trusting those closest to her. She reviewed every case file with fresh eyes. She kept her phone lines encrypted and refused to speak openly about the fire investigation, even with allies. Because deep down, she knew the truth. If Sidwell was behind the fire, then they were already at war, and Port Charles just hadn't realized it yet. He wasn't acting alone. He had people. He had resources. And most dangerously, he had patience. Anna had faced monsters before. But this time, she feared the monster might already be inside the house. And the worst part was, she wasn't sure anyone else could see it. Sasha stumbled back from the threshold of the Corinthos guest house, her heart pounding, breath caught in her throat. As the full weight of what she had just witnessed settled like cold iron across her chest. She had come by to drop off a package Christina had left behind at the hospital, something simple. Something mundane. But what she walked into was something far more horrifying than she had ever expected. Michael, strong, polished, always in control, was slumped on the floor beside an open cabinet. A bottle of prescription pills spilling onto the hardwood, his pupils dilated, his hands shaking. And for a long, paralyzed moment, Sasha couldn't even speak. Because this wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't illness. This was addiction. The realization struck her with brutal clarity. The Michael she had once loved, the father of her late child, the man who had carried the burden of family, business, and legacy on his shoulders, was unraveling in silence. It wasn't just a single bad moment. The signs had been there for weeks, the uncharacteristic mood swings, the missed appointments. The flashes of irritability, the restless eyes that never seemed to settle. She had tried to convince herself he was just under stress from the custody battle, from Drew's rising influence, from Sonny's volatility. But this wasn't just pressure. This was dependence. This was something darker, more insidious, and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. As Michael stared at her, caught, ashamed and angry all at once, Sasha felt her world tilt. She had fought her own demons with pills, had clawed her way out of a medicated abyss after Liam's death nearly consumed her, and now she was staring into the very same abyss, this time through Michael's hollowed-out eyes. It was the cruelest irony. The man who had once tried to rescue her from her spiral was now falling into one of his own. But this wasn't just personal. This was political. This was generational. And this had the power to burn everything down. Because Michael wasn't just anyone. He was the heir to the Corinthos legacy, the bridge between Sonny's empire and Carly's influence. The presumed protector of Wiley and Amelia, and the man who had been fighting for custody with an image built on moral superiority. If the truth about his addiction got out, everything would collapse. The family. The court case. The businesses. The reputation he had so carefully constructed. And worst of all, Sasha realized with dawning horror, he was using during a time when his children needed him most. He was numbing the very pain that demanded he show up. Sasha knew what came next. The lies. The manipulation. The long, winding justification that every addict rehearsed, that it was just to manage pain, that it was temporary, that it was under control. But she could already see it unraveling. The pills weren't new. The behavior wasn't new. The damage was already in motion. And the worst part was that Michael thought he could still hide it. Thought he could still function like everything was fine. But everything was not fine. Not anymore. Sasha couldn't unsee what she saw. She couldn't pretend it was manageable. Because this wasn't just Michael's story, it was Wiley's. It was Amelia's. It was Christina's trauma revisited. It was Carly's worst nightmare. It was Sasha's own past. Reflected back at her in the most devastating form. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She just stood there, trembling, as Michael tried to gather the pills in a frenzy. His voice cracking as he muttered excuses. But Sasha wasn't listening. Her mind was already racing ahead, playing out the consequences, the fallout. The chain reaction that was about to consume them all. She thought about Willow, fragile and still uncertain, tied to Michael by threads that now felt more like nooses. She thought about Drew. Always calculating, always waiting for the moment to strike. She thought about Nina, about Sonny, about the press, about custody lawyers, about the very public. Very painful reckoning that would come if this secret slipped into the light. And somewhere inside her, something hardened. She had survived this hell once. She knew the road Michael was on. And she knew how few people ever made it back. But more than anything, she knew the cost of pretending things were okay when they weren't. She had lived that lie, and it had nearly killed her. Now, standing in the wreckage of Michael's carefully constructed world, Sasha had a choice. To stay silent and become complicit. Or to confront the truth and risk igniting a war that could tear the Corinthos family apart. But as she looked down at the pills still scattered across the floor, at the man she once thought invincible now trembling in panic and denial, she knew that silence would only feed the fire. This wasn't just about saving Michael anymore. It was about saving everyone from the explosion that was already building, and about facing the terrifying truth that one of the most powerful men in Port Charles was slowly, quietly, spiraling into oblivion.